Welcome to Beat Diabetes. I'm Dennis Pollock, and today we're going to be talking about keto bars and sugar alcohols and artificial sweeteners in general. But we're going to do a blood test, or I am. I guess we're not, but I will. You're testing a couple of keto bars to see just what do they do to your blood sugar. And before we get started with that, I thought I'd read a few quotes. Those that I respect have different opinions about whether you should even use artificial sweeteners or non-sugar sweeteners at all. Some people call them artificial sweeteners, but they're not all artificial. Stevia is not artificial, and I think there's one or two others that are not. But basically, we're talking about sweeteners that are not sugar and typically do not raise blood sugar, or do they? So let's get started. So we'll start with a quote by Dr. Jason Fung, whom I greatly respect, although I do have a bit of disagreement about his assessment. He says don't use them at all. Don't ever touch artificial sweeteners, essentially. He says if non-caloric sweeteners could truly reduce diabetes and obesity, then we would not have an epidemic on our hands. Well, I don't quite buy that. Just because something can help doesn't mean everybody's going to avoid diabetes. But let me go on. He says, we've used these chemicals extensively in our food supply for decades, and the empirical evidence is clear. Artificial sweeteners are no better than sugar. Avoid them all. So he is a teetotaler when it comes to artificial sweeteners of any kind, and I would assume that means stevia as well. And he says, well, there's empirical evidence. I'm not sure I quite go along with that. There is correlational evidence to some degree. You can point out that many people who have metabolic syndrome, who have insulin resistance, who are overweight, use artificial sweeteners. But do the sweeteners make them overweight and metabolically off, or does the fact that they're overweight and metabolically off cause them to use the sweeteners? An illustration I could give is if we consider criminals, really bad guys, and where do you usually find them? In the news, in the newspaper, or on various YouTube videos? Often, criminals will be found in the hands of the police with handcuffs on them. Does that prove that if you hang around police, you become a criminal? A correlational study would say, yep. I mean, can you imagine some young lady who gets to know an attractive policeman? And he's single, she's single, he asks her out for a date. She says, oh, no, there's no way I would go out with a policeman. After all, the criminals are always found hanging around you guys. So I'm afraid if I date you, I'll turn into a criminal. Well, that might sound like it's a little logical, but the truth is it's just silly. And so there are a lot of correlational things that you cannot prove anything by. I'll never forget. When I was a young adult, my wife and I went to have dinner with a couple from our church, and the wife was morbidly obese. She was a big, big lady. I would guess well over 300 pounds and wasn't all that tall. And so they fed us pizza. Of course, in those days, I didn't see anything wrong with pizza at all. But I found it kind of ironic, even in those days, that with her pizza, she drank a diet soda. So some people could say, well, you see, that's what's making her obese. She's drinking all these diet sodas. Well, how about the 7 or 8 pieces of pizza that she ate? The diet soda was like, well, I'll atone for my sins by drinking a diet soda with my pizza. So just because we've got a lot of diabetes and we've had artificial sweetness for a long time doesn't mean the two are solidly linked together. So this is from Dr. Richard Bernstein. The book is called Diabetes Solution, his most famous book, most popular book, really a game changer in the diabetes world. But here's what he says about artificial sweeteners. First of all, he says stay away from the powdered sweeteners. And he feels like they often have a filler mixed in with them. And I think he's absolutely right. That can raise blood sugar, although in a small amount it probably won't. So, for example, if I'm eating out at a restaurant and I have some coffee and I want to sweeten my coffee a little bit and put in 1 packet of powdered sweetener, I don't worry much about the fact that that might raise my blood sugar a point or two. Anyway, he does say this. He says, if you have a sweet tooth, there is no restriction on how much of these you use. They won't affect your blood sugar. Rewind, Dr. Richard Bernstein, probably the #1 diabetologist of all time, says they won't affect your blood sugar. So you got two opinions here. Dr. Fung says stay away from them. They're terrible. And Dr. Bernstein says they're not going to affect your blood sugar, but avoid the powdered one. So this is from Dr. Ben Bickman, Why We Get Sick. And he says this about artificial sweeteners. If the sweetener comes in a powder, it can contain glucose-heavy fillers such as maltodextrin, defeating the purpose of the sweetener, which is to not spike insulin. Kind of curious to me that he says the whole point of the sweetener is not to spike insulin. Most people are not even thinking about insulin if they take artificial sweeteners. They're either thinking, A, it'll keep me from gaining too much weight, or B, it won't spike my glucose. But because Dr. Bickman is so focused on insulin, he's like, well, the one thing you don't want to do is spike insulin. And finally, this is from Jenny Ruhl that I really like and have learned a lot from her. She says sugar alcohols are lab-created carbohydrates. Now, we're talking not just artificial sweeteners, but specifically sugar alcohols. She says they're lab-created carbohydrates that may or may not break down into glucose in your body, depending on whether you have the enzymes needed to digest them. If you don't, they won't raise your blood sugar, but they may give you horrible gas and diarrhea. And they do have a reputation, sugar alcohols, for giving you diarrhea and gas. Although I don't think that's true for everybody. If it was, nobody would ever eat them or use them. So differing opinions all over the map. So right now we're going to focus on the keto bars. We've talked about keto bread. I did an experiment last week with my wife about a keto bread that didn't work out very well for me. It jumped me up to about 146, eating 2 buns and then another half. But in this case, we're talking about keto bars. When I was a kid, one of the big treats for me, and I know I was a simple kid, but we all were in those days, growing up in the early 1960s. But one of the treats for me was to go to the drugstore. We didn't call them pharmacies in those days. They were all drugstores. So I'd go up to the corner drugstore, which was about a 5-minute walk from where I lived, and buy a candy bar. And the price in those days was 5 cents for most candy bars, but some of the bigger ones might charge you a dime. So a nickel or a dime, and you had yourself a candy bar. I couldn't tell you how many times I walked up to that drugstore and bought me a candy bar. And I enjoyed and loved the Nestle's Crunch bars. And wasn't too crazy about the Three Musketeers, but probably one of my favorites was the Mound bars and the Almond Joys, also made by the Mounds Company. And these were basically coconut covered with chocolate. With the Almond Joy, they put a couple of almonds on each little mini bar, and it was a lighter chocolate. With the Mounds themselves, it was a darker chocolate, and there was no almond. But boy, I love those things. I think they were usually a dime. You got 2 smaller bars in one package, and they were really good. Well, that was then, this is now, and I haven't eaten sugary candy bars in a long time. I guess maybe if I search through all my archives of my diabetes videos, I might have done it once for a test. I don't recall. But I do eat some keto bars. Now, when I first realized I had to go low carb, there were stacks and stacks of keto bars. They had big stands in the grocery stores and maybe 20 different brands of various keto bars, although the term keto wasn't so popular back in those days, around 2002 or 3. They were just low carb bars. But there were bunches of them. And then they started to disappear. And I don't think they ever totally went away, but almost all the keto foods and bars and breads and mixes, again, they were called low carb, not keto in those days, but they almost all disappeared. Why was that? Because the Atkins craze was just coming to an end. About the time I realized I was headed for diabetes and had to go low carb, the Atkins craze was dying out and people were getting bored and moving on. And so suddenly the stores pulled all the low-carb products, or most of them, I should say. Today, we're back on, baby. There's all kinds of keto products, low-carb products, and keto bars. They're all over the place. in America, and I'm sure in many, many countries, if you live in some village in Africa, you probably can't find any, but in America, you sure can. And with the keto bread, their big objective is to create some kind of a manufactured fiber so it doesn't count as a real carb and theoretically won't raise your blood sugar. But we found out last week, yeah, it can. And you have to be real careful. You have to test yourself, try different brands and see if something works, and then just limit yourself. My normal limit is an open-faced sandwich. If I have a piece of keto bread bought at the store, it's going to be one piece. Benedict and I had bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches yesterday, and it was just one piece. And then you put on the bacon and the tomato and the lettuce and some mayonnaise, but I wouldn't eat two. So today, we're talking about keto bars. This one, very similar to the old-fashioned Mounds bars. I wonder if they still make those. You might let me know in the comments if you know. But these are not big, but they're tasty, and they are essentially like the original Mounds bars, a dark chocolate with coconut inside. You know, coconut is really not a bad food. A lot of times we think of coconut as being sugary, sweet, but coconut in its natural form, it doesn't have much sugar at all. So it's a pretty simple thing for manufacturers to take unsweetened coconut and throw in some artificial sweetener or some type of sweetener that's not sugar, and you've got yourself a low-carb bar. Same thing is true with chocolate. A lot of times we think of chocolate, well, boy, that's full of sugar. No, it's not in its natural form. It's only when we fool with it and add a lot of sugar, then chocolate becomes super sweet. But in its natural form, it's not sweet at all, and you can buy almost zero-carb chocolate, but you won't like it if you don't sweeten it somehow. So let's talk about these. These are called Indulge, made by the Atkins company. Atkins has a good reputation. I remember reading years ago that they tested different products calling themselves low carb, and they found Atkins to be the most accurate company in terms of when they say it's low carb, it really is, and when they say it doesn't spike blood sugar, it really does not. So I'm curious. I'm going to eat 2 of these today. This is going to be my lunch, believe it or not. Benedicta said, are you going to get full? I said, probably not, but nevertheless, for the sake of research, these 2 will be my lunch. Let's talk about what I'm getting. I am getting 19 grams of total carbs for 1 bar. So 2 bars is 38 grams, about what you'd get if you drank a 12-ounce Coca-Cola. So we're not talking low carb in the total sense, but we are talking about low carb in the net sense. It says here right on the package, 2 net grams of carbs per bar. So according to that reasoning, 2 of these is 4 grams of carbs that should affect blood sugar. How will that prove out? Well, I honestly don't know. I never eat 2 candy bars together like I'm going to do today. In fact, I never eat 1. I do eat keto bars, but it's almost always a half or a third, depending on the size of the bar. So that doesn't seem to affect me much. But what about 2 bars? You say, well, Dennis, why would you even do 2 bars? Because I want to push this test to the point where if these keto bars pass, with 2 of them, mind you, and no fat to really slow everything down, if these pass the test and give me good numbers, I'll know that eating my half with some coffee after lunch is going to be pretty safe. So I'm going to have these as my lunch, 38 total carbs, but only 4 grams of net carbs. I'll test myself at an hour after I finish, 2 hours after I finish, and I'll get back and let you know how they did for me. My tests are complete, and with 4 net grams of carbs for those 2 keto bars, there should not be enough carbs to move the needle at all. Maybe just barely. But the needle got moved. It was not as good as it should have been if you disregard all those other carbs except for the 4 net grams of carbs. So after 1 hour, 120 milligrams per deciliter, not terrible, but should have been better in my estimation. After 2 hours, and this is where it got even worse, it was 126. Again, not terrible. It's not a humongous spike, but I am used to seeing the 2-hour number lower than the 1-hour number. In this case, it continued to rise, and it caused me to go ahead and wait for 3 hours to see what would happen there. And finally, at 3 hours, it did go back to 100, so got down around baseline for me. Now, granted, when you just have these 2 bars by themselves, you're looking at probably a worst-case scenario. Had I had some protein and fat, a big meal, and then had those at the end of the meal, I suspect I would have got better numbers. And had I had a salad beforehand, probably I wouldn't have gotten that bad of numbers if it had been a low-carb salad. Still, though, for those 2 bars, 4 net grams of carbs should not have gone that high, and it just kind of confirms my suspicion that these products in the stores that are called keto are not maybe the best choices. They're not terrible, and again, let me just make a couple of comparisons. I did a banana versus regular candy bar test. In fact, it's really one of my most famous viral, if you will, videos. I think it's been seen by over 1 million people. And the 2 bananas spiked me up to 222 in an hour's time. 2 good-sized bananas, well over 200 in an hour. So 120 for these 2 keto bars, it doesn't look like much compared to 222 for the bananas. Now, I did the next day the same test with 2 candy bars. They were Hershey's cookies and cream bars, and they didn't spike me as high as the bananas. They went to 169. So again, 169 wasn't as bad as the bananas, but it was significantly worse than the keto bars. So keto bars are definitely a better choice than regular sugary candy bars, but they're not perfect. And of course, this was 2 bars. I never eat 2. As I mentioned, I never even eat 1. I usually eat a half. Sweet potato. I did a test with a sweet potato some time ago. And it took me to 168 after 30 minutes, big spike, and then 201 at 1 hour. So these and a lot of people, to them, natural is everything you want. As long as it's natural and nobody's tampered with it, nobody's added anything, you're good. But the bananas were not tampered with, and they took me up to 222. So natural is not always the answer. Keto is not always the answer. What you want is natural foods that are naturally low carb. In addition to Beat Diabetes, Benedict and I do have another YouTube channel and another type of ministry. I'm referring to our Bible teaching channel, which goes by my name, Dennis Pollock. While you can only see Benedict with me on Beat Diabetes occasionally, you can see us study the Bible together at our dining room table every Thursday. With all that we're doing, producing hundreds of videos and podcasts, sponsoring African missions, helping diabetics reverse their diabetes, giving food to African widows, and sponsoring free medical clinics in Nigeria and Kenya, we need your help. Please consider making regular contributions to Spirit of Grace Ministries.